Hey, listen!
Welcome everyone, this is Andre's Restart, and this time I want to have a quick little discussion on the timeline placement of the memories in Tears of the Kingdom. Not necessarily where Tears of the Kingdom takes place in the timeline, because that's its own debate, but just a debate centered around the memories in Tears of the Kingdom, those cutscenes that we can acquire by exploring the world. Now, I do not want to spoil those who have not beaten the game yet, so I'm just going to give you a warning now. There will be spoilers in this video, so just be aware. We won't be talking about specifically the end of the game, but we will be talking about a lot of the story of the game, so do keep that in mind. Now, before we go forward, let me point out that we are aiming to hit 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, but we're actually approaching 30,000 subscribers. We're just a few hundred away, so if you enjoy my content, if you love Zelda theory videos or just Nintendo speculation in general, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Your help could just make the difference. Now, firstly, I'd like to point out that whatever my theory may be, I don't mean for that to be in any way an offense to whatever your theory may be. I'm not saying one theory is right, one theory is wrong. I will say what I think it is, but ultimately, I think there isn't necessarily one correct answer. I think the way things are done, they leave it up for debate intentionally. These are legends. There is room for interpretation. As more games come out, as more evidence presents itself, our understanding of the history of Hyrule can change. This is discussed in Hyrule Historia. This is probably why whenever we get interviews with Fujibayashi or Aonuma or even Miyamoto, they're always a little bit coy about what exactly is going on with the timeline. At the end of the day, gameplay is the ultimate focus for the Zelda series, but when I say that, I don't think that means that the stories are bad, but they think about the game first and then they come up with a setting afterwards, and as a result, not everything's going to fit in as neatly. That all said, I do think ever since Fujibayashi has been the director, and he directed Skyward Sword, then Breath of the Wild, and most recently Tears of the Kingdom, I do believe there's a little bit more thought put into this. They did come out with that initial timeline when Skyward Sword came out, and since then, at least with these last three major games, there does feel like there's a strong connection between them. You have the goddess statues, you have the emphasis of the sky, you have this implied sky barrier that dispelled in Tears of the Kingdom. It all seems to sort of connect. But when we look at the events that transpire in the past, when Zelda goes into the past and we see these different memories in the Tears of the Dragon Quest, there are a lot of different thoughts out there on where exactly this all takes place. My belief is kind of at face value. When Zelda gets there and meets King Rawa and Queen Sonia, they straight up say that they are the founders of Hyrule. The game tells us that this era that Zelda finds herself in is the era of the founding of Hyrule. It is the beginning of the establishment of the monarchy of Hyrule. And what's interesting about this is that this doesn't mean it's the very beginning of the Zelda timeline, because the very beginning of the Zelda timeline is Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword, at the end of that game, the people of Skyloft come back down to inhabit the land of Hyrule, and it's implied that eventually that will then become the Kingdom of Hyrule. But it's not like that at the end of Skyward Sword. So with this all in mind, what I think is happening is that we have Skyward Sword, then we have the memories of Tears of the Kingdom, and then we have every other Zelda game that takes place afterwards. And because this event would take place before Ocarina of Time, a few games into the future, there's no real timeline splits to worry about, because Ocarina of Time is when the timeline splits up. So that's what I think this is. Now, I know there are some counter arguments, and I'll get to those a little bit later into the video, but I want to talk about some other ideas that some people have thrown out. So while I think these events take place in a single timeline that happens before the major timeline split, there is a debate that maybe Skyward Sword causes another timeline split. And basically, if you think that time travel causes a timeline split, then yeah, there is that potential that there is another timeline that stems from the beginning of Skyward Sword. And that may be how some may come to an answer as to why there are some elements in Tears of the Kingdom that don't seem to entirely match up with their understanding of the series. And I'm not going to outrule that possibility, but let's also keep in mind that the events of Skyward Sword, there were things going on in the beginning of the game that were also the case at the end of the game. Impa always had the bracelet, which Zelda also has throughout the game, but gives Impa in the past, and then when we go back to the future, Impa still has that bracelet as an old lady, but then also Zelda herself is encased in that amber stone in the back of the temple the entire time. This appears to be a closed time loop. In other words, nothing that we do in the past changes the future. They're both connected. What happens in the future and the past, they work concurrently with each other. And this is exactly how things transpire in Tears of the Kingdom. It's also a closed time loop. What happens in the past and the future happen concurrently. One cannot exist without the other. So when we're exploring the prologue of Tears of the Kingdom, we see the history of the Imprisoning War being told upon the wall. Now some of it's obscured, but it is there. So all the events that transpire in the Tears of the Dragon quest are already recorded in history, and if those boulders were broken down, Zelda would see that herself was in the past, transforming into the Light Dragon. And Ganondorf already knows who Princess Zelda is and Link, because of the interactions of her going to the past before she went to the past. So the ultimate point I'm making here is the way time travel works in Skyward Sword is the way it works in Tears of the Kingdom, which further supports the idea that these games are more closely connected than prior games. Anyways, my take is that there isn't necessarily any new timelines being created in Skyward Sword or Tears of the Kingdom. I'm not saying there can't be. Not many expected that Ocarina of Time would have created 3 different timelines, but it did when we eventually got the canon timeline. So perhaps 5-10 years from now, if Nintendo decides to update the timeline again, we may see another timeline split or two. It's totally possible. But another idea that I find really fascinating that could potentially explain what's going on in the memories of Tears of the Kingdom is that this isn't the first founding of Hyrule. And I don't totally believe this idea, but at the same time, it's possible. And I do think there is some things that could suggest it. So, for example, throughout Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, you can find these items called rock salts. And these rock salts, when you check the description, it makes a reference to an ancient sea. And I believe the implication here is that at one point, there was an ocean covering a lot of the world, which might suggest that this game takes place after the events of the Wind Waker, which is in the adult timeline, just one timeline. Now again, this video isn't about talking about the timeline placement for Tears of the Kingdom, but there are signs that support Tears of the Kingdom Breath of the Wild taking place in other timelines as well. The reason I bring up the rock salts is that it suggests that there is this history of water covering everything. So what if it's the case that because things happen so far into the future, eventually the Great Sea, those waters recede, and the land of Hyrule is born anew. And this eventually leads to the events of Tears of the Kingdom with the memories. So a new Hyrule is founded. Personally, I think we need a little bit more evidence to believe this, but I will tell you, I do really like the idea of the depths being a hint towards an ancient past of Hyrule. There's a lot of exotic plant life down there that almost looks marine-like. If I could find some direct comparisons where this plant life matches something we would find underwater, I think that would make the argument far more compelling. If you look at the walls, they almost look like something that might have like fossilized coral, for example. I haven't seen that exactly, but it does look potentially something like that. And there are also a lot of giant trees and ancient roots, potentially hinting at the forest that the Deku Tree was trying to grow across the seas in the Wind Waker. I do believe that what they're trying to depict with the depths is that there is an ancient history here, which is why some of these things may look somewhat like that. But really what I would love to find is some hard evidence that the depths at one point were underwater. If this is found, then I would be more likely to entertain this theory even further. Now, another consideration that some have had is that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are just a straight reboot, and they don't really consider or value any of the prior history of the different Zelda games, so it doesn't really matter, and what happens here is just outside of all other Zelda games. I don't really buy into this because I do think that there's a lot of signs pointing towards a history of Hyrule. In Breath of the Wild, they make mention of the hero of time, the hero of the skies, the hero of Twilight. You could get into all the different costumes and items that make references to all the different Zelda games, but I do feel like that is maybe just kind of extra fluff stuff for fun. What's more compelling to me are the memories in Breath of the Wild that tell of that history. But as I mentioned earlier in the video, there's a lot of allusions towards Skyward Sword as well, especially with the goddess statues. And then there is the telling of the Imprisoning War, which is an important part of Hyrule history, although it's been shrouded in legend and mystery for years. So I don't really like to think that they're just ignoring all prior games. But the reason why there are these different theories is because there are things that happen in Tears of the Kingdom that don't make sense for a lot of people. For example, the presence of Ganondorf. The way this Ganondorf is being treated, he becomes the Demon King. He is this source of evil and malice that leads to the Calamity Ganon, apparently. And because he's technically alive for this entire time, many find it hard to believe that there can be other reincarnations of Ganondorf from this point throughout the entire history of Hyrule. Well, first let me say that we've already seen that there can be more than one Ganondorf in a single span of time. So in Four Swords Adventures, Shadow Link is representation of another Ganondorf. On page 119 of Hyrule's story, it says this: Shadow Link. Demons identical to Link that are born of the Dark Mirror and possess the power of darkness. The resentment and evil thoughts of the defeated Ganondorf travel across time and space, emerging as shadows in the shape of the hero. So the resentment and evil thoughts of a defeated Ganondorf from a prior time take up the form of Shadow Link in Four Swords Adventures, even though there's already a reincarnated male Gerudo called Ganondorf. So with that precedent already set, I don't think it's a stretch to think that the Ganondorf we see in the memories of Tears of the Kingdom, or just Tears of the Kingdom as a whole, is the original Ganondorf, and while he is sealed deep underground of Hyrule for a very long time, there can still be other events. And when we think about how Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom make references to other events throughout history, I think it's totally feasible. The different forms that Ganondorf takes are varied. There's a lot of different things that can be done. Ganondorf is capable of possession, Ganondorf is capable of living for millennia, Ganondorf is capable of creating puppets to manipulate others. So my perspective is that the Ganondorf we see in Tears of the Kingdom is the original Ganondorf. He is the first incarnation of that hatred of demise, that spirit that's been eternally bound to follow the generations of Hyrule. And I think this makes even more sense because what we see of the Demon King version of Ganondorf, it's quite reminiscent of demise. I think there is meant to be an inspiration there. I think there's meant to be a connection there. Now, some still might not think this makes sense because with Calamity Ganon, it comes from this corpse of Ganondorf that's under Hyrule for all this time. But just because Ganondorf is sealed here, that doesn't mean the Calamity attack starts immediately. In Breath of the Wild, it implies that the Calamity attacks happen after many eras of battles with Ganondorf, or the incarnation of demise, whatever he is at that time. Raru's seal breaks down little by little over time, so as the seal slowly breaks down, the Calamity attacks start to happen. The malice starts to pour out and build up. So I believe the Calamity Ganon attacks happen after the different events we see throughout the Zelda timeline. But it doesn't impact my belief of the memories taking place in this period of time I've been arguing. Now, sticking with Ganondorf for another moment here, because there is an Imprisoning War to seal him away, some feel like this is maybe retconning things or implying that the time period may be different. But my perspective is that while yes, this Imprisoning War is very different from the Imprisoning War that takes place before Link to the Past, because that's after Ocarina of Time, this would be before Ocarina of Time, I just think there can be more than one Imprisoning War. I think the idea of an Imprisoning War is when there's not a dedicated hero, the spirit of the hero, to thwart Ganondorf, and he needs to be sealed away instead without the power of the Master Sword. So the original we know of is the events before Link to the Past, where the sages work together to seal away Ganon, and now we have this one where there isn't a Link, but we have Rauru and the sages alongside Zelda who sealed away Ganon throughout this long history of Hyrule, starting from the founding of Hyrule. But I also think there's at least one more Imprisoning War which kind of supports this theory. So, in Skyward Sword, or rather the events before Skyward Sword, Demise, when he had his Demon King army, they needed to stop him. There was a war to stop and seal away Demise. Demise is sealed away similar to Ganondorf. The seal is slowly breaking down throughout the events of Skyward Sword, which is why you have to fight the Imprisoned, which is an incarnation of Demise, and repel him to keep the seal intact. I don't think the boss fight that we fight multiple times, it's called the Imprisoned, is a coincidence. I think this is another example of an Imprisoning War that occurred at one point before even the events of Skyward Sword. So we have at least 3 Imprisoning Wars, there may be more. Point being, it doesn't really take away from my thought process here of where this all takes place. But something else that has bothered some people in terms of believing this idea is that we see Rito in the memories of Tears of the Kingdom. And the thing about the Rito is that the Rito came into existence in the Wind Waker, and it was implied that they evolved from the Zora, and it took a very long time for this event to occur. And maybe at one point, that's what the Zelda team had intended. But in Breath of the Wild, the Rito and the Zora are living alongside of each other in the same world. So perhaps at the time of the Wind Waker, the understanding was that that may have been the case, but maybe there are other Zora. Maybe some Zora became Rito, but there were still other Zoras around. It was a tangential evolution. There are more than one type of Zora. But even if you believe that to be the case, the Rito came into existence in the Wind Waker far into the future. Well, also not necessarily. So in Twilight Princess HD, they made an interesting change. There are stone monuments that show bird-like people in the telling of the histories of Hyrule. So the implication being that Rito have actually been around for a very long time. And what's really interesting about this is that Twilight Princess HD was made during the development of Breath of the Wild. Now some may argue, yeah, but Twilight Princess HD was made by Tantalus, not by the Zelda team. Sure, but why would we assume that the Zelda team didn't approve of this? We already know from interviews that they want us to play Twilight Princess HD and keep it in mind while going into Breath of the Wild. There may be things that we saw there that could make connections in Breath of the Wild, and that could be one of them. So the different species we see in the memories doesn't really derail anything in terms of my understanding of that these memories take place after Skyward Sword, but before all other Zelda games in the timeline. And I think there can be more than one Ganondorf, so this same Ganondorf, this potential original Ganondorf, can still be underground Hyrule, while there are other Ganondorfs wreaking havoc throughout time. Maybe even this original Ganondorf played a role into those other Ganondorfs becoming evil and doing everything they did. He influenced them with his own spiteful, hateful spirit. The same way you could argue that's what the Spirit of Demise is doing. It's all maybe one and the same. Now, something else that I've noticed about the memories, and I've talked about before, but some people disagreed with, is that we have a depiction of Koemi and Kotake in Tears of the Kingdom. They are young versions of these two witches that were the surrogate mothers for Ganondorf and Ocarina of Time. And my belief is that the depictions we see in Tears of the Kingdom of these two characters that are by the side of Ganondorf, they are the same Kotake and Koemi. They aren't different incarnations, they are the same people. Because we know they live up to about 400 years thanks to their crazy magical witch powers. So my belief is the founding of Hyrule happens about 400-ish years before the events of Ocarina of Time. But some don't find that to be a believable amount of time. Except I do. The only games that take place between the founding of Hyrule and Ocarina of Time are the Minish Cap and Four Swords. Not every Zelda game is thousands of years apart. We know that Twilight Princess takes place about 100 or so years after Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. This is a different Link, a different adventure, a different series of events. So if about 100 years can be the difference between two different major games, why can't about 400 years be the difference between two games and a little bit of history? I think it's totally conceivable, and I think that this Kotake and Koemi absolutely can be the very same ones we see in Ocarina of Time. So my overall point here is I think they support my idea that this is the original founding of Hyrule, not a new founding of Hyrule. And something else to note about this idea that maybe the waters receded in the land of Hyrule in the events of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, that theory can still apply. It would just happen after all of these events. It would happen after the founding of Hyrule, after Minish Cap, after Ocarina of Time, after the Wind Waker. And while there may be different things that we see evidence of for different timelines, I've discussed this in multiple videos before, that it could just come down to similar style events happening eventually. I call it the eventuality theory. Perhaps no matter what, there will always be Rito. Perhaps no matter what, there will always be Lynels that come down from the mountains. Perhaps no matter what, there will be the Shadow Invasion, the events of Twilight Princess. So currently, that's what I think. I think the memories of Tears of the Kingdom take place in that era before the timeline split in Ocarina of Time. It happens before all other games except for Skyward Sword. But of course, that's just my theory. I'm sure there are other theories that can work too. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. This is Andres Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care.